Perfect. So introduce our keynote speaker. I could talk about Brian for probably an hour. You could maybe try me tonight during the dinner, but I will keep it short. Brian is a external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute, a IBM faculty fellow, and a visiting researcher in the Intelligent Systems Labs at PARC in Palo Alto. Now, again, I'm going to try to keep it short, but a few things that I want to mention here to put Brian's keynote into context. You may know, and a few of you have mentioned Brian already today, so as some of you will know, Brian coined the term complexity economics a few years ago and wrote several papers on subjects, including one that I will truly recommend to all of you, open access, entitled Foundations of Complexity Economics, published in 2021. Brian also developed the framework around several concepts that were mentioned today, including lock-in, feedback loops, path dependency, and increasing returns. He also contributed to developing agent-based modeling and applying these techniques of simulating how agents interact and therefore will impact their environment to economic theory, and something which is very dear to me. Throughout his career, Brian always remained creative, starting all of his papers pretty much from the real world as opposed to starting from the literature, right? And I think one of his latest paper, which I think Brian will discuss today, entitled Economics in Nouns and Verbs, is a great example of Brian's unique stance in the field and creativity. On that, Brian, you have 20 minutes, then we will do 10 minutes for the Q&A, so please be ready to fire some questions. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here, even if it's pretty early in the morning in California. What I want to say in the few minutes I have is my version of what I think complexity economics is all about. I won't go into technical details. What I want to do is just give you an overview. I'm sure most of you have heard of complexity economics, and some of you may be practitioners. Anyway, here's my take on it. I will start with standard neoclassical economics that I was brought up on. It's very much based, as you know, on mathematics. And to make the mathematics work, we are forced to make a lot of simplifying assumptions. So in nearly all models that we look at with standard neoclassical economics, we're using equation-based mathematics, where we assume all agents are, we tend to assume agents are identical to keep things simple, that they've perfect knowledge of other agents because they're just the same, that all agents in the economy, the decision makers, are perfectly rational. And together, all agents arrive at optimal behavior consistent with or in equilibrium with the overall outcome caused by that behavior. It's an ingenious shortcut to doing theory. It's brilliant. I'm dazzled by the mathematics. It gives you a view of the economy that's extraordinarily elegant. And as I say, it's rather beautiful. I'm trained mostly as a mathematician, so I find this quite gorgeous. But, and this is a huge but, if I'm giving slides, I generally have one slide that says but on it in huge letters. It's highly restrictive with its assumptions and very often unrealistic. I'm not the only one who says that. For about 100 or more years, actually, since Veblen, quite a while ago, economists have been complaining, it's beautiful, but hang on, just how realistic is this? In a word, complexity economics relaxes these assumptions. So it comes out of a thought process. What would it be like if we had an economics where agents, the models we build, agents could realistically differ? What if they didn't have perfect information about other agents? What if they just didn't know much about other agents? This would leave them trying to make sense of the situation they're in. You'd see them exploring. They'd be reacting to what they see. They'd constantly change their actions and strategies and update these as well as they could. In that case, that may not lead to an equilibrium. No equilibrium is assumed. If there's a natural equilibrium in that situation, it might emerge, or it might not. So once you start to assume more realistic assumptions, the problem is that models start to get more complicated. And when they get more complicated, we have to resort to keeping tabs computationally. If I have 1,000,000,001 or 1,001 agents and they differ, I can't keep all those in my head. So I need to resort to computation. And I would make a fairly strong statement, if I've got a little bit of time towards the end, that this approach, I think, of making things more realistic and trying to see how things play out more realistic is not new. A lot of economists 100 years ago must have thought of that. What is new is the coming of computation that allows us to look at these more realistic, complicated approaches. I want to say a few words of where this framework came from. It didn't kind of arise out of nothing. There was a meeting in the very nascent Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico in 1987. It was convened by Kenneth Arrow and Philip Anderson. Anderson is a top Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Arrow, I'm sure you know, is a top economist. Arrow brought 10 theoretical economists to the meeting. Anderson brought 10 physicists and mathematicians. The physicists and mathematicians included Don Farmer, that you may have heard of, now very much an economist, and John Holland. The theoretical economists included Tom Sargent, Larry Summers, and other people you would recognize, including myself. The meeting was spectacularly successful and on for 10 days, I remember, and we were all dazzled by what the physicists were doing, and they were a bit dazzled by us. They thought most of the neoclassical stuff was kind of old-fashioned, but it gave them an insight into economics. And the Santa Fe Institute decided to constitute a program of research on the economy as a complex, an evolving complex system. A year later, I was brought back to head up that program. This was the Santa Fe Institute's first program. We didn't really have staff. We barely had a building. SFI was a startup. So there we were sitting around a table. We didn't quite know what to do. This was all in an old-fashioned convent we'd taken over, and there was a kitchen, and we could sit around and debate. We have money from Citibank, we have the backing of top economists and physicists. What on earth are we going to do? This went on for 3 or 4 weeks. I wasn't at all sure what to do. In the end, I called Ken Arrow at Stanford. This is before emails, and I said, Ken, I said, we're not quite sure what to do. We're not quite sure how daring we can be here. What do you think? Arrow called Anderson at Princeton, and Phil Anderson called John Reed, who was chairman of Citibank at the time and was putting up the money. The word came back from Reed via Anderson via Arrow to me: do anything you like, providing it is at the foundations of economics and is non-conventional. I was staggered. It was like, I don't know, suppose in 1520. This was the thought I had immediately. Suppose in 1520, Martin Luther had indirectly got in touch with the Pope, says, we're redoing theology. What would the Vatican think? And the word comes back from the Pope, do anything you like, providing it is not conventional and at the foundations. We were totally staggered. We decided to drop the whole notion of equilibrium. We would, if we're not against equilibrium, but that wasn't going to be an assumption. We decided if we built models that the agents in these models could differ. Then, of course, we realized we were in hot water immediately, because if agents could differ, we should also assume that other agents didn't know exactly how they differed and how they thought. In fact, that was maybe subject to fundamental uncertainty. You just don't know what the guy down the street is doing. I'm standing here talking in Silicon Valley, and if something new is getting launched here, you don't know what your rivals are thinking, not in any detail anyway. That, the moment you introduce that sort of uncertainty, problems become ill-defined. There's no amount of logic can solve things if certain parts of your problem are fundamentally uncertain. You don't know what the problem is. So once the economics are an economic problem's ill-defined, solutions ill-defined, and you have to grind to a stop. We had John Holland with us, and I think to this day that was a miracle. John had been spending decades teaching computers how to get smart when they didn't know what situation they were in. And we borrowed a lot of his thinking and a lot of his methods. And we realized that in the real economy, agents may not know totally what they're doing, what problem they're in. Think in terms of maybe 3 years ago, we didn't know what COVID was. We didn't know how bad COVID would be. We didn't know when vaccines were coming. We didn't know, yet we all went forward together, albeit a little bit scared, I suppose. And so we could model agents kind of having a go at things and learning along the way mutually as the situation unfolded. This gave us an overall approach, and we developed it by continually solving standard problems using this new outlook. I want to say there are other groups working maybe in parallel. I mentioned Rob Axtell, Josh Epstein, and others. But the main effort, I would claim, it was at Santa Fe. At the end of the decade, science, as Thibault just mentioned, asked me to do a paper on this science journal. And the editor called me from London and said, like your paper, what do you call this new approach? I said, I don't call it anything. No. He says, what do you call this new approach? You need to give me an answer. So I said, no, I don't need to give you any answer. Anyway, it went back and forth. I lost. And I said, all right. I said, call it complexity economics. It was one of these things kind of dropped from heaven. I was standing with a landline in my apartment in Palo Alto, and that label locked in. One thing is, if we have a new approach in some science, if we have a different approach to solve problems, a really good question to ask is, can it solve any problems that the previous approach cannot, or can it give more satisfaction in explanation than the previous approach? And this actually really concerned me. So we selected a puzzle in standard economics. It's called the question of asset pricing. Just think of it as how do stock market prices in a simple stock market arise? And if you have some earnings that go up and down stochastically, how would prices track the earnings. That problem had been solved by Robert Lucas in 1979. He wrote, this was using standard economics and standard assumptions and pretty good mathematics. And the Lucas solution I thought was dazzling. It was brilliant. It was gorgeous, elegant work. But he did assume standard assumptions. And in fact, he assumed all investors were identical. So there's a but to this. It very much looked like and tracked how real markets worked, and I thought that was a huge step forward and beautifully elegant mathematics. But there are a number of phenomena you see in real stock market pricing that the Lucas model couldn't show and didn't show. Bubbles and sudden crashes, even if they're in different scales. Technical trading, meaning agents pay attention to past prices and to trade volumes, periods of very high volatility followed by periods of quiescence. A market psychology emerges in a real market. There's real trading volume. Lucas's solution showed none of these. It was quite embarrassing in a way. People are trading, or at least they're in the stock market, but trades are zero. That sounds shocking, but if everybody's identical, they all either want to buy or they all want to sell. They can't trade. And the price just adjusts so that everybody's indifferent between buying and selling. Along with John Holland in 1988, John and I put together a team and we set up Lucas's model to work possibly on a computer. And we excised out, we slid out Lucas's identical investors and we replaced them with ones that could in principle differ, in fact could differ. We made each of these its own little computer program, maybe a tiny little computer program to make decisions. Each investor, call them artificially intelligent investors now, could respond to its own collection of, if the market's doing this, then I forecast that. If the market's doing something else, then I have a different forecast. And these rules could be thrown out if they didn't work very well. New ones could be developed as necessary. In other words, we set up what was now called the Santa Fe artificial market with investors who are small, primitive AIs, and we let them make bids and offers for stock. So we set all this up and ran the model. We kind of had a bet on our good friend Tom Sargent, really a superb theoretician. Tom said, you know, you're not going to get anything out of this weird and wondrous model with different investors, then it'll just be attracted to the Lucas solution. You're not going to see anything new. When we got the price series, sure enough, it looked identical to the standard neoclassical solution of Lucas. I was really disappointed. Then we worked out the standard solution, plotted our price series against that, and what we saw was quite amazing. This was looking more closely at the data. We had bubbles and crashes. Our model showed the emergence of technical trading. We saw periods of high and low volatility. A market psychology emerged, meaning different opinions. Trading volume was not zero, it was quite significant. So all these phenomena you might see in real markets in New York or London or Frankfurt were emergent phenomena. Our new approach had discovered real phenomena that standard methods couldn't see. I want to say in the remaining time, there's been many, many studies since. some in Santa Fe, many elsewhere. And one overall theme that we see is that the economy that results is not so much a machine, this affects that, that affects this, equilibrium is reached. It's much more like an ecology. So what you're really building is an ecology of differing actions, different beliefs or forecasts, maybe different strategies. And as this ecology evolves and changes, different beliefs and strategies get emphasized. In general, there's no equilibrium. You might see perpetual novelty. But within the system, agents learn and adapt. Temporary phenomena like very high volatility or low volatility may emerge, and maybe even new behaviors emerge and are discovered. So the economy in this way, under complexity economics, becomes something not given, not pre-existing, but constantly forming from a developing set of actions and strategies and beliefs. So it's not mechanistic, static, timeless, and perfect, but rather I would say it's organic, always creating itself, and alive. Maybe I'm getting over poetic here, but brimming with or full of messy vitality. I'll just, in the remaining minute or so, I want to make one comment. Why did this approach arise now? Why not in 1939 or at the time of where Samuelson was giving deep thought as to foundations of economics? My comment is that new tools in economics always bring new theory. So when geometry came along, we got a lot of armchair theory or blackboard type theory, but it gave us new insights. When algebra and calculus came along in the 1870s, in due course by Samuelson's time, that brought us neoclassical theory. I think we progressed a lot in getting neoclassical theory. Now computation is bringing us an economics that can handle heterogeneous agents, can handle fundamental uncertainty because we can model how people actually behave when they don't know, and it brings us non-equilibrium. So it's not surprising that this approach arose in the 1980s and early 1990s, because that's when we all got desktop computers. Thanks very much.
So we have about 10 minutes for question. Do we have any question? David, I think you're first.
Brian, thank you for a brilliant talk. And I think the members of the Dynamic Competition Initiative are very sympathetic to complexity economics and systems theory more generally. But tell us, what are give us 2 or 3 principles that we should keep in mind as we think about, I'll call it a workable systems theory or administrability. If we try to apply these principles to competition policy and innovation, are there 1 or 2 things that we should always bear in mind as we think about antitrust enforcement?
Well, I would say this just generally about the approach. I realized yesterday with the skip and the heartbeat that I was talking to people who, a group of people, particularly including David here, who had developed a dynamic framework for looking at competition, and who probably what's missing here, and I'm sure people are working on this, in fact, people like Thibault and others, Beau as well. What's missing, I think, as yet is what's the relation between these 2 different approaches. I don't see that they're that different. One comment I would make if you're looking for principles is that dynamics in our case, complexity economics, are not assumed. We allow agents to react to the situation they're in, and that reacting brings about change and brings therefore about brings in dynamics. One of the assumptions we dropped in complexity economics was the assumption that there were always diminishing returns on the margin. In fact, as you well know, all of you, when it comes to tech companies or technology, very often there are increasing returns on the margin. The more of my friends join PayPal, the more I'm likely to join PayPal so that I can transact with them. So as PayPal gets larger, it gets more advantage. And I think that what emerged, I think in the 1980s and 1990s, was an awareness that you could do economics. I'm certainly involved in this. Other people were too. You could do economics in markets that showed increasing returns and therefore led to large concentrations of market share and led to monopolistic situations. You could do that if you were willing to assume that you'd have to model this as small events, probabilistically leading you into one of many results. It goes back to what Alfred Marshall said in 1891. If you have N firms, he said, competing under diminishing costs, the larger they get, the lower their costs go. The market, he said, will go to one firm, but you can't tell which. And I think that what your approach and what I'm talking about here, one strong connection or principle, is that we don't need to get scared of multiple equilibria, because sometimes one equilibrium is reached, sometimes another one, and that's leads me into thinking that in all these cases, not just do dynamics emerge, but the outcome emerges as well. And the use, make a third principle here, and that is heavily dependent upon computation. I'd like to say, strictly speaking, computation isn't necessary. All the early work I did in this field was done by using nonlinear stochastic process theory. So you can do mathematics if you're willing to, a bit more complicated. But in general, to keep track of things and to theorize and think deeply about things, we're forced to look at situations computationally, and then figure out how did this emerge or how did that emerge. So my overall answer is that I wish I knew much more about dynamic competition, and I think there's a strong relation between the framework I'm proposing and the framework that you're dealing with here, and all I can do is cheer you on.
Yes, there are two questions. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, Brian. I'm a big fan of using computers in economic research. Gordon Phillips here. There is one issue I always struggle with. You know, I don't believe the representative agency that we can't have, one or two, but at some point you've got to reduce some of the complexity. We can't have, 5,000 different consumers, different types. So how do you put bounds on this? Is that if there's no equilibrium force that winnows out occasionally some irrational consumers or irrational actors?
Okay, great question. Two things. No, it's not computationally, it's not necessary to say there's an upper limit like 5,000 agents. To my staggering astonishment, my good friend Rob Axtell produced a model last year. I think it was in the housing market in the the UK, where he had several million different agents in his computerized model. And you try to make sure the types of agents you get do reflect reality. You can do that, or maybe you're just using a thought experiment. There's a subtle point here about rationality. What I said was, once you don't know what other people are doing, the problem becomes ill-defined. If the problem is not well specified economically, that I know this or I know probability distributions, if you just don't know, in the sense that Keynes talked about, he says, sometimes we can put a probability on a situation, but whether there'll be a war, he said in 1937, in 3 years, we don't know. We don't know what the price of copper will be. So you could put probabilities and well define a model. In what we're doing here, we don't resort to that. We assume we just don't know. And then, so agents then are looking, it's as if they're exploring the dark, trying to figure out what tunnel they are in underground and where it's leading. There, if you don't know and agents can't optimize, but they're feeling their way, there is no such thing as a rational agent. If there's not a rational problem, there can't be a rational solution. So we make no assumptions about rationality. The results I gave for the stock market are not due to irrationality, because rationality in that sort of model is not well defined. They are the result of exploratory agents finding ways to learn and cope in a situation of other exploratory agents. Rationality might emerge, an equilibrium might emerge, but it's a very different way of thinking. And it's a wonderful question. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question, please, Johannes. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University. In the session right before this one, we discussed a European new legal initiative, the Digital Markets Act, that aims at improving the governance of digital ecosystems. And I'm not assuming that you know sort of the details of that law, but I mean in general, from your research on ecosystems or on complex economic systems, right? What's the role of governance? Can governance improve the outcomes of those systems? And how can we model this? How can we analytically try to grasp how governance influences the dynamics in such complex systems?
Sure. I think there's been a lot of work here, and it's probably work that you see in your dynamic competition framework as well. What people are talking about is setting up policy labs. I don't do much work along these lines, but certainly other people do. So what you're looking at is not so much to make a definitive model or an equilibrium model or a rationally based model. You're trying to set up a model that captures the situation you're looking at, and then you regard that as like a lab experiment to see what the outcome is, and you can change certain things, certain parameters, or you can change the situation as you like. You can rerun the model and then see what the outcomes are. So it's not, I think, a very deep approach. It's more like John Holland used to talk about flight simulators for the mind. If you can simulate an aircraft, you can put it into different situations and see how it responds. And I think that a lot of people are doing this for policy. I don't think this is particularly new, but it's a different flavor from neoclassical methods. Other thing I would point out is that, and I'm fond of this analogy, if it's a large ecology, my own approach would be not to think of if I may, I would say the standard neoclassical approach is very much an engineering one, where you regard yourself as being a very large power station, say a nuclear power station, or at the controls, and you're turning this dial and pulling that lever for policy. Once you start to think of the outcome as being an ecology of competing or sometimes cooperating behaviors, then you can think of yourself not so much as tweaking the system with large dials, but actually more as a park ranger. I'm introducing this type of species. I'm fencing here. I'm looking after things there. And for me, that's a very different outlook. It's just saying we're dealing with an ecology here. Real ecologies, there's an awful lot of trees were wiped out in the 1930s onwards in the US and no doubt in Europe as well, because it became legal to shoot wolves. Wolves disappeared. That meant that elk and other tree grazing animals became plentiful. That meant that small small fir trees and so on disappeared. That changed the whole ecology. So it's this sort of thinking: if I introduce this, if I leave that out, if I pull back on something else, if I put up guardrails, what am I going to get? It's not radically new thinking, but it's a different way of approaching things.
Brian, I'm going to ask you a very last question, and it's a complex question, and I'm going to ask you to give me a short answer, which I know is very unfair. So the question would be, I'm going to run two examples, and the question is what we would need to keep in mind if we indeed wanted to develop those experimentation, right? Because you made a point that we are maybe not ready to fully implement complexity economics into antitrust. So if we need to experiment, those are two ideas that I have. With agent-based modeling, you could actually, at the very micro level, find a way to assess how each agent may address trade-offs in a very different manner, right? On the more macro level, you would see that agents, and that's the point you made in your Alfaro paper, will actually learn from which of their hypotheses will work, right, and create a macro trend. So if we were to develop those agent-based modeling to test, let's say, the impact of competition law or any regulation, what would be the key element to keep in mind so that the result of the simulation are not totally bunker?
You're right, complex question. I can't find a simple answer, but the guideline, I'll just tell you what my instinct would be. My instinct would be to say, I'll do two things, and they're somewhat at odds. One is I would try to model the situation fairly simply and run it and rerun it under slightly different circumstances and slightly different assumptions until, looking at the outcome, I felt I had a very good intuition for how that worked. And then following up or doing this in parallel, I would try to look at reality and say it has the following characteristics. In the market for Uber and Lyft in the United States, there's a debate, are there increasing returns? Is there a lock-in? Yeah, but one thing you can do is to make assumptions and get a feel for that whole market. It seems to me that the increasing returns only increase and then flatten out. Doubling the number of Ubers around isn't going to help that much generally. But I would explore the situation until I fully understood how it worked and had a good intuitive feel from looking at agent-based models, say. And then I would look at reality and say, where does it fit in the parameter space of what I've been looking at? And let's get a good feel for that. I hope that's more or less what where you're heading. That
well,
question.
I think that's a perfect segue to my introduction. I mentioned that Brian often started his paper from the real world, and you ended up on the necessity to compare the result of research with the real world. So on that note, please join me in applauding our keynote speaker.